This is Christopher Sernaque hosting episode 13 of season 5 of the Current Topics in Science podcast. This podcast will address breaking scientific news in light of the origins debate and host interviews with scientists. Today we'll be talking with Dr. Brian Miller about thermodynamics and the origin of life. This podcast is available on the following platforms: iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Video recordings of the podcast will be uploaded to YouTube. Enjoy the podcast. Today on Current Topics in Science, we have the honor of hosting Dr. Brian Miller. Dr. Miller obtained a Bachelor of Science degree in physics with a minor in engineering from MIT, a PhD in complex system physics from Duke University, and is an expert in the physics of thermodynamics and information theory. Dr. Miller is the research coordinator for the Center for Science and Culture at Discovery Institute, helps to manage the ID 3.0 research program, and was the primary organizer of the Conference on Engineering in the Life Sciences. He's also consulted on organizational development and strategic planning, and he's a founding member of an innovation consortium that developed into the Startup, a virtual incubator dedicated to bringing innovation to the marketplace. He's contributed to multiple books and technical journals covering the debate over intelligent design, including The Mystery of Life's Origin, The Continuing Controversy, The Comprehensive Guide to Science and Faith, and Inference Review. He's a regular contributor to Evolution News and Science Today and the ID The Future podcast. Now, without further ado, good afternoon, Dr. Miller. How was your day, and how are you doing?
It's going very well. It's a pleasure to be here again.
Always a pleasure to have you on Current Topics in Science, Dr. Miller. And speaking of current topics in science, let's take a look at this week's current topic. Today we're going to be looking at an article called First Law of Thermodynamics Breakthrough Could Upend a Century of Equilibrium Theory in Physics by Micah Hanks. Hanks quotes Professor Paul Issac as saying, "People have been working on extending the laws of thermodynamics for systems not in equilibrium for over 100 years. Most of what people had figured out is hard to extend the laws of thermodynamics for systems that are close to equilibrium. Even this is a huge step forward and has been useful in many fields of science." Hank reports that this research is being used to devise a way to generalize the first law of thermodynamics, which allows it to be applied to systems that are not in equilibrium. West Virginia University Today reports Professor Issac is saying, "We generalize the first law of thermodynamics for systems that are not in equilibrium. We did a pencil and paper calculation to find how much energy is associated with matter not being in equilibrium, and it works whether the system is close to or far from equilibrium." Professor Issac spoke excitedly about the results, saying, "The results represents a really large step of our understanding. Until now, the state of the art in our research area was to account for energy conversion only associated with expansion and heating, but our theory provides a way to calculate all the energy from not being in equilibrium." Dr. Miller, as someone who is an expert in thermodynamics, can you tell us, what did you think of this current topic?
Well, it's really fascinating because what happens is when people think of thermodynamics, it's basically the physics of energy exchange, entropy exchange, things like that. And what happens is the thermodynamics is really well founded if you're quote unquote near equilibrium. And that simply means that there's not enormous fluctuations in temperature or the mass concentrations. So you're just dealing with energy slowly entering or leaving, or you're compressing a cylinder. And it's been much, much harder if you're dealing with systems that are far from equilibrium. That would be like, in their research, they're looking at plasmas, where you have extremely hot temperatures, where you have very complex distributions of matter and energy. You've got kinetic energy turning into possibly matter if you're in a star. So what's happening is those equations are much more complicated. So what these researchers have done is essentially come up with a much more sophisticated way of bookkeeping, of how do you actually keep track of the energy that's going back and forth from kinetic to matter to momentum. And if you expand that in plasmas, which are incredibly complex physics, you can talk about even nuclear reactions. So it's really very valuable research.
Dr. Miller, I am grateful that you shared your thoughts on this incredible breakthrough in thermodynamic study. And on that note, before we continue with the rest of the questions, let's examine the 4 laws of thermodynamics. Dr. Miller, may you please describe the zeroth, first, second, and third law of thermodynamics?
Certainly. Yeah, what happens is the zero law of thermodynamics is fairly simple. It just says if you've got some system, and let's say it has a certain temperature, and that system is in equilibrium with a second system, it's also in equilibrium with a third system, which means that they have the same temperature. And that would mean that the 2 systems that are connected to that system also have to be in equilibrium. So it just means it's fairly straightforward that they all have to have the same temperature, essentially. Now, the first law of thermodynamics is one that's much more commonly used in physics. What that says is that energy is conserved. So commonly, if you have, let's say, 2 objects, they bounce into each other and they bounce apart, then what happens is the energy you start with is equal to the energy you end with. Now, it can change form. Like you could have kinetic energy, which is energy of motion, turning into heat. But energy is never lost, just simply changes form. Or if you have like a nuclear reaction, you can have energy which is basically in the existence of mass. And let's say you have a nuclear reaction and some of the mass turns into energy, then you have, again, a change of form, but the energy is always conserved. That's the basic idea. And then the third law of thermodynamics is essentially that entropy in a closed system will always stay the same or increase. Or even in an open system, what happens is the total entropy of the universe will always stay the same or increase. And in practice, it always increases. And the third law of thermodynamics, which is a bit less commonly known, is that if you've got some object and it's heading towards absolute zero, and the entropy is approaching the lowest value possible. That's the third law, which doesn't really come across. It doesn't apply in most practical situations.
So, Dr. Miller, hearing you aptly describe the 4 laws of thermodynamics brings to mind the quote from physicist C.P., who stated that a non-scientist who didn't know the second law of thermodynamics was like a scientist who had never read Shakespeare. Being both a novelist and a physicist, he saw the laws of thermodynamics as being important to familiarize ourselves with, scientist and layperson alike. Dr. Miller, with that theme in mind, what role do the laws of thermodynamics play in the origins debate? Are they relevant to this discussion?
Yeah, they're actually really central because the laws of thermodynamics will tell you what chemical reactions or physical processes will tend to take place and what directions will they go in. So, for instance, if you have a chemical system, what'll happen is that system will either increase in entropy, which means it'll become more disordered. You've got, let's say, large molecules breaking into smaller molecules, or that system will become a higher energy system. Or if you want to use chemistry terms, that's sometimes called the enthalpy, which means it'll tend to give off heat because the chemical bonds that are high energy bonds are becoming lower energy bonds, or it'll do both. It'll both go to both higher entropy and lower energy or enthalpy in the case of chemists. And the challenge of the origin of life, though, is for the chemicals on the early Earth to become a cell, they have to simultaneously, this soup of chemicals has to go to both low entropy or high order, speaking more crudely, and high energy or high enthalpy. And that will never happen in any natural system unless you've got some sort of machine, some sort of complex machine that's forcing that to happen. So the problem with the origin of life is for it to happen spontaneously without outside intervention and assistance. You really have to throw out the most fundamental laws of nature.
That's really incredible. So, in other words, the laws of thermodynamics are highly relevant to the origins discussion. And while we're on that subject, your chapter in the book, The Mystery of Life's Origin, is called Thermodynamic Challenges to the Origins of Life. So, you stated that the only plausible explanation for the origin of life is intelligent agency. Dr. Miller, can you tell us what evidence was it that led you to that conclusion?
Yeah, certainly. And there's two lines of evidence. One would be the evidence that a cell couldn't form naturally, which is what I addressed. And the second evidence is the positive evidence for design in minimally complex cells, like a cell that's as simple as it can be and still exist. And in terms of the first category of evidence, I had a very nice exchange with Jeremy England in the journal Inference. And Jeremy England's considered is probably the world's most well-known expert on thermodynamics and the origin of life, and a very respectful scientist, an excellent scientist. And what he talked about is how these fluctuation theorems can drive a system in a certain way that'll self-organize to direct that energy in some interesting ways to create interesting patterns. And in our exchange, we got into a very high-level conversation about this. And as it turns out, his research refutes pretty much every origin of life theory that's either known or they may come across later. And the reason for that is these fluctuation theorems show that even in systems driven far from equilibrium, as we talked about, like you boil water and you get these roll patterns, or you're shoving some high energy chemical into a soup, what happens is even far from equilibrium, systems will still tend to go towards higher entropy. They generate entropy, which is, again, the wrong direction for the origin of life. And they tend to go to lower free energy. So again, arguing that simple chemicals could form into a cell is like trying to argue for a perpetual motion machine. You essentially have to abandon the laws of physics. Now, what's fascinating about his model is he talks about how life actually works. So that really begs the question of, why does a cell exist? If the physical laws are trying to break it down all the time, why does it even exist and how can it reproduce? Because a cell reproducing, you're essentially taking low energy, highly disordered chemicals and creating, this highly ordered, high energy cell. Well, the only way around the problems I mentioned is if you've got machinery. And this machinery, what it does is it will convert some form of energy, raw energy on the earth, let's say it's a chemical or it's sunlight, into a processed form of energy that's useful for life. And in case of cells, you have things like ATP, which is a high energy molecule. And you also need information. You need to have a blueprint for that cell, and then you've got to have the machines that force chemical reactions and structures to form that conform to this blueprint. So the only way around that is, one, to have the machinery that creates the energy you need, and information that tells you how you want to direct that energy and create the structures that you need. And in my exchange with Jeremy England, he either directly or tacitly acknowledged all of my points, which was really significant. So there really is no way for a cell to form naturally. In fact, one of the most important papers on this is by one of the leaders of the field named Stephen Benner. He has a Harvard pedigree. He's an extremely, he's a brilliant scientist. And he wrote a really excellent article. It's called Paradoxes in the Origin of Life. It's a 2009 article, if I recall. And what he states, and I'm going to actually quote directly from him because it's so significant. He says, an enormous amount of empirical data have established as a rule that organic systems, given energy and left to themselves, devolve to give useless complex mixtures, asphalts. He goes on to say that further, chemical theories, including the second law of thermodynamics, bonding theory that describes a space accessible to sets of atoms, and structure theory require that replication systems occupy only tiny fractions of that space, suggests that it is impossible for any non-living chemical system to escape devolution to enter the Darwinian world of the living. And again, Stephen Benner is an atheist or agnostic, I'm pretty sure. So he is absolutely committed that the origin of life is purely natural processes. Despite his bias, he says, and note that he doesn't say that it's an unsolved problem. He doesn't say it's a hard problem. He says everything known about physics and chemistry suggests that the origin of life is impossible because it violates the most fundamental laws of physics in everything that's known about chemistry. Now, at the end of the paper, he changes hats, where he goes from the hat of an objective scientist to the hat of what might be called a high priest to the secular faith. And what he does is he says, despite all these challenges, we still have to have faith. We have to believe it's possible. We just have to assume there'll be new theories or new ideas that will solve the problem. So again, that's very significant. But it really is blind faith that he states that. That's the negative side, that chemicals can't form life naturally. The positive side, and this is research I'm working on, relates to studies of minimally complex cells, like Venter is a classic example, where they look at how simple can a cell become before it will not function. It'll just break apart into simple chemicals. And then also I've studied what are theories on self-replicating machines. People like von Neumann, who is a mathematician, people like NASA that studied what is a minimally complex self-replicating space probe. Other researchers have looked at minimally complex robots that could self-replicate. And what you find is if you look at the theory of self-replicating, like, and theoretically, how simple can these self-replicating systems become? And what does that look like in practice with like NASA or robotics? What you find is there's a set of minimally complex functions that have to be there. These functions have to be there. And now you compare that to studies of minimally complex cells, and there's a beautiful alignment that whether you're looking at the biology or the engineering or the theory, any cell, for it to not break apart into simple chemicals, has to have machinery for energy production and delivery, information repositories and processors, selective gateways with the active transport. That's like a portal to the outside that will force the right chemicals in and the right chemicals out. Sensors coupled to signal transduction pathways and signal processing. It has to sense the environment and its internal states. Actuators that implement instructions, manufacturing, auto assembly processes, automated repair machinery, error correction systems, waste disposal and recycling mechanisms, and control systems capable of global coordination. So what that represents is positive evidence for design, which is indisputable. So both from the physics, which shows the origin of life is not possible, to the engineering analysis that shows these are the minimal complex features, the positive evidence for design is indisputable. That's why I've come to that conclusion.
Dr. Miller, that was an incredible answer. I liked how you mentioned that the origin of life theories have now become perpetual motion machines, something that just isn't going to happen. But actually, speaking of machines, you mentioned the minimally complex cells. Like, I know there are cells like the mycoplasm, but could you tell us more about the minimally complex cells?
Oh, that's a great question. So you look at people like Ventners, is they look at like a mycoplasma, which is a parasite. So it can live in a living organism, which is like living at the Hilton. Everything is provided for you. It has all the nutrients, all the raw materials. But that's very different than, let's say, living in the middle of the Gobi Desert. So if you're looking at the simplest possible cell on the early Earth, it would have to do everything itself. So if you look at like the simplest free living cells that can basically do everything themselves, they're much more complex than the mycoplasma. So what happens is if you look at any theoretical analysis of minimally complex cells or any experimental work where you're dealing like taking away proteins until it stops functioning or taking away genes, you always are going to come across the same set of minimal requirements. You're not going to get below several hundred essential genes. And that's just the essential genes. You don't have to have multiple copies of proteins. You've got to have control feedback loops or the system will crash, and many other requirements also. So if you were very, very generous and incredibly optimistic, the amount of information required from minimally complex cell that won't just break apart would be kind of like the story A Christmas Carol. That's the sort of information we're talking about. If you're incredibly optimistic, it's probably a lot more than that. And again, if you think about the thermodynamics, if you imagine any scenario going from basic chemicals to a cell, you're constantly going from equilibrium to a very high energy, high ordered system. And nature is trying to push that system back into simple chemicals, lower energy states. So no matter what step you are in the origin of life, if you stopped right there, what's going to happen is all the natural processes will break that system back down to simple chemicals. That's the problem, is you have to go against the laws of nature to an extraordinary degree for any scenario for the origin of life. And there's simply no way to get around that problem.
So, Dr. Miller, in our last question, we looked at the chapter in the book, The Mystery of Life's Origin. And I would appreciate it if you could expand your thoughts on this quotation here, where you wrote, "The odds do not improve if the process takes place in multiple steps separated by extended periods of time. In fact, the challenges actually increase if each step towards life does not proceed immediately after the previous one. For the chances of the system moving towards higher entropy or lower free energy are greater, far greater, than moving in a life-friendly direction. any progress could be completely squandered by a few deleterious thermal fluctuations or chemical interactions. Therefore, all origin of life scenarios appear thermodynamically implausible. So, what exactly do you mean when you say deleterious thermal fluctuations and chemical interactions can render naturalistic origin of life scenarios inert?
Sure. And this really gets into a lot of the origin theories because what happens is there is a lot of steps that have to take place to go from chemicals that would have been on the early Earth to a functional cell. And that each step is really hard. Each step, something highly improbable has to happen. So most origin of life researchers argue that it took a long, long time. So it's like a ratchet. You get one step, and then you get another step, maybe another 1,000 years, you get another step, and you kind of keep going up. So the idea is that maybe happening at once is fantastically improbable. But if you break the probabilities down into small little steps, it might be more tractable. But the problem is you have to get everything right at once. Because let's imagine some amazingly improbable set of circumstances occur and you get halfway to a cell. Well, what's going to happen to that semi-functional cell? Well, every natural process practically is going to break that cell back down into simple chemicals. So let's, for instance, imagine you've got a protein that's essential from some chemical pathway. Well, what's going to happen? Thermal fluctuations would be like water molecules or other molecules bouncing into it and colliding with it, or energy transferring back and forth. What is that going to do? It's going to cause a protein to unfold. So that protein will no longer be useful for the cell. And that's why in cells, what happens is you've got lots of very complex machinery that repair things. They repair proteins. They repair the cell membrane. They correct errors in DNA. So without all these, repair mechanisms, a cell is going to break down into just simple chemicals. It's like if you have a house and it's a perfectly fine house, everything is automated, but you just let the house sit there for 1,000 years. Just natural processes will cause it to break down into a pile of rubble. Again, you have to go back, you have to fix the windows, you have to repaint it, you have to keep undoing the damage done by the natural processes. The exact same thing is true of a cell.
Dr. Miller, that was incredible. Thank you very much for going over those evidences against a naturalistic origin of life. Indeed, now that we have taken a look at your critique of the naturalistic origin of life, let's take a look at the American Scientific Affiliation's critique of your work. Dr. Randy Issac, who obtained his degree in physics from the University of Illinois, wrote this critique of your work in the book The Mystery of Life's Origin. He stated, "The next chapter, provided by Brian Miller, a physicist at the Discovery Institute, bears the title Thermodynamic Challenges to the Origin of Life. Miller considers the number of configurations that are possible for various arrangements of the components of a rudimentary living organism. He then calculates the probability of a successful random assembly of all these components at one time to be so many orders of magnitude improbable that no one would rationally consider it possible. He's right, of course, and no one does. He asserts that the results would be the same if the assembly occurred in multiple steps rather than in one glorious shot, but his calculations fail to account for the Bayesian probabilities given the feedback and impact of natural selection at each step. He considers neither the influence of population effects nor the effect of a more generalized goal. Miller concludes with this single paragraph on the metaphysical implications, though he's not stated what constitutes signs and evidence of design. Dr. Miller, may you please share your thoughts on Dr. Issac's response to your work? Do you find his critique valid? And if not, what evidence leads you to disagree with him?
Yeah, and I appreciate Randy Issac. He's a very sincere Christian. But what happens is when you're trained by secular scientific institutions, the training is not purely in scientific theories or in techniques and processes, but part of it is a catechism into a philosophical framework. So you're trained to see the world through the lens of what's called scientific materialism. And scientific materialism states that everything in nature has to be explained in terms of natural processes. So he's coming to the table assuming I'm wrong. He's coming to the table assuming there is no evidence for design. He assumes that there has to be a natural process that explains life. He has to assume that every challenge is simply based on what we don't yet know. So that's significant to realize. Now, what happens is he talks about, in what you read, there's so much some assumptions behind what he's saying, because he talks about goal. Well, what's his goal from? I mean, what's his feedback for a goal? Only an intelligent agent has goals. And the feedback systems he talks about don't exist. It's purely fictitious. He gives no examples of what that would look like. He has no idea because it's just fiction. But what happens is he talks about populations, and he's tacitly referring to natural selection. So he's assuming that something is reproducing, and then natural selection is causing that system of self-replicators. And usually people assume it's RNA molecules. That's kind of where they usually go. But it doesn't matter what you assume. It's something self-replicating. Others assume it's what's called an autocatalytic network of reactions, like Hoffman. That's another approach. But then they say, well, there's feedback. There's natural selection moving towards this goal of life. But that makes absolutely no sense, because nothing is reproducing. Until you have life, you don't have populations. You don't have feedback. You don't have selection taking place. That makes no sense. So he's invoking natural selection not as a real process, but more like a demigod, like a demiurge from Gnosticism. And this is what almost all origin of life people do, even though there's no basis for it. Now, what they will do is talk about self-replicating RNA. That's kind of where they're going. But the problem is, again, that's pure fiction. Because when you, in fact, let me just read to you a quote. Again, I read a quote from Stephen Benner before, but in the same article, he says something else about these ideas of self-replicating RNAs or any self-replicating molecule. He says, again, quoting Benner, if a biopolymer is assumed to be necessary for evolution, we must resolve the paradox arising because implausibly high concentrations of building blocks generate biopolymers, that's like RNA that replicates, having inadequate amounts of information. These propositions from theory and observation also force the conclusion that the emergence of, in this case, biopolymer-based life is impossible. Because here's the problem. If you look at, let's say, RNA, you first have to have nucleotides. And the problem is, if you look at all of the research on what it takes to get nucleotides, you have to have highly orchestrated chemical reactions in a laboratory where you're constantly changing conditions and adding the right reagents and changing the temperature and the pH to get RNA. But even with all of that intervention, you get the tiniest fractions of your products as being nucleotides, let alone RNA. So what happened in any realistic setting, and this is what Benner fully acknowledges, is that any nucleotides that formed would far more likely connect with some other molecule that's not biologically relevant than with each other to form RNA, which are just chains of nucleotides. But even if you imagine the impossible, even if you imagine some ridiculously optimistic settings so that you produce lots and lots of RNAs, the problem is the chance of an RNA having the right sequence of building blocks, of bases, like letters in a sentence, that would cause this RNA to fold into something that could drive replication is fantastically improbable. I mean, it would be much less probable than these simple nucleotide chains that do something like combine two RNAs together, called ligation. And that would be like 1 in 100 trillion chance for that to happen. So these self-replicating RNAs would be much less common to that. But what happens? RNA in water breaks apart. So let's imagine you've got just some fantastic numbers of RNAs. And let's even assume that they self-replicate. So you create this perfect laboratory setting where you have a bunch of RNAs that self-replicate. The problem is you would need trillions of these things in like a beaker, or else the rate at which they would self-replicate would be slower than the rate at which they break apart. So the whole system will crash. So this whole idea of self-replicating RNAs is absolute fiction. It cannot happen in the real world. So again, Randy Issac is appealing to natural selection, even though natural selection could not exist. But here's what's really also interesting also, because what happens is I talked about how the secular scientific training is like a catechism into the faith of scientific materialism. And researchers are told over and over again, only religious fanatics believe there's design in life. You don't want to be looked as a religious fanatic, do you? So you're trained to suppress any evidence of design you encounter. And what was interesting about his critique is he says that I offer no positive evidence for design. But if you read his quote of me, he quotes a paragraph, but he cuts out a certain part of the paragraph that I wrote, little ellipsis. And let me read to you what I wrote. What I wrote essentially is that in any other context, the identification of a nanotechnology vessel capable of energy production, information processing, and the other identified requirements would immediately be recognized as the product of design by any reasonable criteria. And also had that long list I mentioned was in that paragraph. So his philosophical blinders forced him to censor the positive evidence of design from my writings. So naturally, he concluded that I had no positive evidence for design because all of it was filtered out by his philosophical blinders. Now, I don't believe he was being deliberately deceptive. He's a very honorable man, as far as I can tell, but he doesn't appreciate how he's been blinded from the truth by the philosophical framework of scientific materialism.
Dr. Miller, thank you for responding to Dr. Issac's critique of your work. And before we close out, I would also appreciate it if you could take a look at Dr. Issac's general critique of the theory of intelligent design. In the same paper critiquing the book, The Mystery of Life's Origin, Dr. Issac wrote this general critique of ID theory. He said, "How can we understand whether a genomic sequence or the biomolecular assemblage of a living cell is specified? We can determine only whether the organism in which the cell exists, survives, and can reproduce. In sharp contrast to the previous examples, no symbolic or abstract connection is involved. In fact, there is no example of an intelligent agent ever providing an a priori complete genomic sequence that would assure specificity. The information is not encoded in an abstract code, but in a code embodied in a biomolecular system. It is indeed a true code, but it can function only in its physical embodiment and not in a symbolic form. As humans, we represent and model this information symbolically, but its specificity can be determined only in nature in its physical form. No intelligence is required. Neither is it clear that it is even possible for an intelligent agent to make such a determination." Dr. Miller, what do you think of Dr. Issac's critique of the theory of intelligent design? Do you find it compelling? And if not, what evidence leads you to disagree with him?
And again, he's engaging in a massive exercise of circular reasoning. In fact, let me go through all the technical babble and let me explain to you his argument in very simple terms. He'll acknowledge that, things like specified complexity information point to design in human artifacts. But he says if you can show or demonstrate that nature could produce these things in life, then it wouldn't be designed. And then his next step in the logic is that he assumes everything in nature is a product of natural processes. Therefore, you can't show that what was produced in life is design because we know everything is produced by natural processes, so we can reject design. So because he assumes there's no design, he then justifies concluding there's no design because on faith he believes there must be a natural process to produce it. So again, it's an entire argument from circular reasoning. And I think it's really interesting to go through some of his comments. He says the information is not encoded in an abstract code, but in a code embodied in a biomolecular system. It is indeed a code, but it can function only in the physical embodiment and not in a symbolic form. That makes absolutely no sense because every code is embodied in a physical system if it's going to be useful. If you have something like a telegraph operator in the Old West, you have a Morse code, but the Morse code is embodied in a physical system, namely the telegraph operator that's putting the dots and dashes. Computer codes, ASCII code in computers are embodied in physical systems, in computers, or they're not useful. In the same way, the genetic code is a real code, The information in life is real information. It encodes things like feedback loops, control systems, information processing. That is indisputable evidence of design. But its basic logic is because it's in life, and we assume life is simply a product of natural processes. Therefore, life does not show evidence of design because we assume it's not designed. That's kind of the logic he's using. But let me use an analogy. If you've ever seen the movie Contact, Jodie Foster works for SETI, and she gets a signal from space she observes, and it contains the encoded information for a spaceship. Now, no one's going to say, Jodie Foster, you really can't assume that was produced by design because that's unscientific. We have to assume that they're self-replicating stars and they're somehow being selected for spaceship encoded signals. Now, that's ridiculous. No one would say that. Anyone would say that you've got the signal that has information for a vessel that has all these features. It's designed. In the same way, if you look at the information in DNA, for the simplest possible cell, you see indisputable features of design. So again, Issac's critique is entirely based on his philosophical assumption that there can't be design in life.
Thank you for addressing Dr. Issac's critique, Dr. Miller. When I was first reading Dr. Issac's critique, I almost got the impression that he was likening the intelligent design theory to a form of pareidolia. So it would be akin to, say, seeing a cat in the clouds. That cloud is sort of shaped like a cat. But what I thought is that's not the argument or the point that ID theorists are making. They're not saying, well, that object there sort of looks like a cat, or it sort of looks like something else. What you're saying is that you can actually distinguish between the actions of an intelligent agent versus, say, natural happenstance. It's sort of like when you consider forensic science. You can tell that in the case of arson versus a building burning down naturally, in one circumstance, a lightning strike hit the building and burned it down. But in another circumstance, you can tell from our uniform and repeated experience that there was the actual volition of an intelligent agent. So intelligence is something that is detectable. Would you say that's a fair characterization, Dr. Miller?
Yeah, it's exactly right. Because what happens is people that talk about, we can confuse design with clouds that look like cats or whatever example you want to use, or a geode that can look like a cross. It's clear they don't want to see the truth. It's clear they've made no effort to understand the evidence of design. They haven't read the books or the arguments carefully. They simply assume it's false, and they'll grasp at the flimsiest straws to justify their bias. Because if you look at work like people like Bill Dembski, Winston Ewart, Bob Marks, they've dealt with these issues in great depth. Because when you're looking for design, there's three criteria. One is it's something that isn't going to be produced by a natural process. So if you look at, let's say, waves on the beach, if you look at sort of sand that creates little ripples, that's something that can be produced by waves. Not difficult to explain. You're looking for something that's highly improbable. So if you have, let's say, alphabet soup, and you notice in that alphabet soup the word cat, you're not going to assume that was a message from God. I mean, it's quite probable that those letters could come together. So it has to be something that's highly improbable. And you're also looking at patterns that are specified. They match externally defined patterns. They have significance, meaning, purpose. So if you were to look into clouds and you notice that the Declaration of Independence was written out in the clouds perfectly, you would not think that that was like a cloud that looked like a cat. The specificity is too great. The improbability is too high. If you, again, looked in your alphabet soup and you were sick and the alphabet soup had letters written out, take care of yourself, get a lot of rest, drink lots of fluids, get better soon. You would know that's not just from chance. You wouldn't be able to explain that message from the chemistry of the pasta or the physics of boiling water. That large quantities of information beyond a threshold always, without exception, without ambiguity, point to design. So in the case of life, the amount of information in the genome would have to, as I mentioned, be at least as large, probably much larger than a Christmas carol. You're seeing the same machinery that we use, things like information processing, error correction. I mean, this is not ambiguous. This is not like a cat in the clouds. So again, those sorts of arguments reflect what happens when people start with the assumption that design cannot be detected. Now, I suspect what you'd find is if the financial incentives, the career incentives, and the social pressures were reversed, neither Randy Issac nor any other critic would have any problem telling the truth about the evidence of design in biology. But the bottom line is, it's kind of like in the first century. The Roman Empire didn't care what you believed as long as you engaged in emperor worship. As long as you did that, your private faith was fine, as long as publicly you embraced the public faith. In the same way, the secular academy says that you can have whatever private faith you want. That's fine. But you have to look at the world through the lens of scientific materialism when you do your work. You must suppress the evidence of design you encounter, or else you will not get the good professor positions in universities. You'll not get acclaim by secular sources. No, and quite the contrary. You could lose your job. So this is the challenge. It's not serious scientific arguments against design. It's philosophical commitments.
Dr. Miller, thank you for addressing both of those critiques from Dr. Issac. And I'm sure you'll agree that critiquing and questioning a scientific theory, like the theory of intelligent design, is a part of the scientific process. And on that note, let's say that Dr. Issac and the other scientists who do not hold to the ID theory are in the room with you, and you have the chance to talk to them. Let's say they're open to hearing about the predictive power of ID. Dr. Miller, what exactly is the intelligent design theory offering to the origin of life researchers in the scientific community?
That's a great question. And that really gets into a revolution that's taking place in biology, particularly fields like systems biology. Because as people are trying to understand the higher level organization of living systems, whether it's a cell or a complex organism, they're realizing the only framework to understand that is engineering. So what you're seeing is engineers and biologists are working together more and more all the time. And what they're doing is they're looking at the engineering motifs used in life, like controlled feedback loops, four-bar linkages, information processing with error correction, and they're using that knowledge from engineering to understand life at a much, much deeper level. There's a really beautiful paper that I believe I mentioned last time by Dean Schultz, where he looked at the bacterial flagellum, which is an outboard motor in a bacteria, from an engineering perspective. And he was able to anticipate the systems that would be present and their interrelationships and a lot of constraints based on this engineering logic. So an engineering framework is not just a valuable framework for understanding life. It is the only framework for understanding life. So what you're finding is more and more biologists who wish to advance the science are embracing design ideas. It's just at the end of the day, they may give homage to evolution, and they'll say evolution did it. It's not unlike if you look at athletes from North Korea who win an Olympic medal. They will always thank Kim Jong-un for their success, even if he played no role. And it's kind of the same thing. You have to give homage to the Darwinian framework, or else bad things happen to you and your colleagues. So again, this is already happening. It's not theoretical. It's not in the future. It's now that a design framework is showing how to understand the higher level organization of life, because you have to ask what its purpose is. You have to look at systems theory to understand life in a meaningful way. And that is the future of biology. So people will resist it because of their philosophical assumptions, but there is no stopping it. It's just a matter of time before people will come to the terms, the fact that life looks designed because it is designed.
It sounds like ID truly is a fruitful scientific theory. And speaking of fruitfulness, do you think that human beings are close to creating true artificial intelligence? ChatGPT is seen everywhere in the news and on social media, and tech giants are working on developing more advanced AI. Dr. Miller, in this interview, we were speaking about the origin of life, and so I think it begs the question, will humans be able to generate true artificial life or intelligence? What do you think?
This isn't necessarily my expertise. There's other people like Bob Marks who wrote the Non-Computable You that go into this in more depth, but dialoguing with them, what is very clear is that we're nowhere close to mimicking true intelligence. What happens is all of these algorithms, what they do is you program them to solve a task, like play Go, or to synthesize words together based on a cue. but they're always algorithms. They don't show true creativity. They don't show true initiative. They just do what they're told to do. And we're certainly nowhere close to creating self-awareness, because how would you even begin to do that? How would you begin to program a computer to be self-aware? Where would you start? What would the algorithms look like? So we're nowhere close to generating true intelligence. And certainly, I'm not convinced it's even possible for a computer to mimic self-awareness. So that's kind of where I think we are in the field. But again, Bob Marks and others have come up with very nice books that deal with that issue in more depth.
Dr. Miller, we have now come to our final question. In our interview together, we got to cover life's origin, or rather its creation. So, while not all ID advocates are Christians, you are, and so can you tell us, how do we develop a relationship with our Creator, Christ Jesus?
That's a great question. In fact, for me, what happened is I went through enormous faith crisis when I was in college and became pretty convinced Christianity was just a psychological crutch. And what I realized, if God didn't exist and I'm just here as an accident and my death is an accident, what's the purpose of life? All my memories will be gone. Eventually, the sun will explode and our Earth will be vaporized. Or even if we colonized other planets, which is unlikely, the universe will run out of free energy. So there's no point to life. And so I said, God, I don't know if you do exist, but if you do exist, prove it to me. And the evidence of design in nature is something God gave everyone. Romans 1 talks about how his indivisible power, his character, nature, is built into creation. Design is everywhere deliberately for us to see it. But that's just the first step. What happens is I said, God, if you're real, prove it to me. And that led me on a path where I looked at things like the evidence for the resurrection, which is overwhelming. So that was very encouraging. But also I encountered God in a very powerful way. I saw miracles. I experienced his love and power personally. And it's both the intellectual journey and the personal experience that brought me back to faith. And the challenge for people isn't that not knowing God is an intellectual puzzle. The problem is our will and our rebellion from God that blocks us from knowing him. So the first step for me and for all of us is to say, God, if you are real, I want to know you and I want to follow you. Help me to see the truth. And it's in a posture of humility that God help me and will help others to come to know him. And then knowing him, it really involves recognizing that he's the center of our existence. He created us to be in a relationship with him. And it's only through knowing him in a very deep and personal way that we experience true life, true purpose, true meaning, true joy. And what happens is when we do that, God walks with us day by day. I've seen God answer prayer. I've seen God guide my life. I've experienced him work through me to help bring healing to others. And that's really what it means to know Christ, is to fully give ourselves, surrender our will to him entirely and allow him to direct us, empower us, forgive us, and transform us. And then we see his activity in our life. And that's the most powerful evidence of all.
Dr. Miller, thank you very much for your time. It was an absolute joy. And to our listeners, thank you very much for taking the time to learn with us on current topics in science, where scientific discoveries are examined in light of the origins issue. You can find Dr. Miller's biographical information, his credentials, and written works in the description. You'll also find links to his numerous video lectures and a link to the Christ Jesus Ministries merch store. Please share and subscribe to the Current Topics in Science podcast. It is available on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Thanks again for listening, and remember, the truth saves.